Short answer, the period from the 15th century until the early 20th century, when sailing ships evolved to be able to sail all over the world ocean, connecting every region of the world across the sea. Before this period, the sail had also dominated travel on the sea, but it had been localized to the individual oceanic regions. This changed with the age of sail, which roughly corresponds with the age of exploration. The age of sail set out in Portugal under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, who oversaw the development of the caravel, which was much more capable of traversing the open Atlantic than the heavier and slower Mediterranean cargo ships. Under the Navigator, the Portuguese started to chart down along the African coast, following the Canary Current and developing the Volta, which allowed them to return against the flow of the current. The initial goal of the Portuguese was not to sail around Africa, but merely to reach the gold-rich African kingdom of Mali, circumventing the Moorish trade routes in the Sahara. This is one of the central moving points of the age of sail. From its very inception, it was grounded in the fact that Europe's isolated position at the edge of Eurasia meant that trade went through many middlemen before arriving, greatly increasing the cost. Furthermore, the products that the European kingdoms could exchange were often not that sought after and thus difficult to trade if not in volume. This would remain a problem until industrialization. Thus, the costly trade situation in Europe meant that huge benefit could be reaped by those who could find a way to cut out the many middlemen. This is what the Portuguese started to do by going to Mali around the Sahara, by following the Canary Current, and thus the age of sail was born. The Portuguese did not stop just because they reached their initial goal in Mali, but continued to press further south along the African coast. At the same time, their Spanish neighbors entered the maritime race, copying many of the developments of the Portuguese, including the caravel and the larger carack that had much larger cargo capacity. It was not the ships alone that made the age of sail, but also the knowledge of the currents and winds that could propel the ships to their destination. And as the Portuguese had a significant head start south along the African coast, the Spanish opted for trying to beat them to the east by going west, which Christopher Columbus did in 1492, thus inadvertently discovering America. This is where the age of sail also became the age of discovery, as the discovery of America set off a race to sail out and discover more new lands rather than just search for routes to go around the middlemen to destinations that were unknown to exist. The Portuguese succeeded in reaching India around Africa in 1498 under Vasco da Gama, and from 1519 to 1521 the first circumnavigation of the world was done by the Spanish under Ferdinand Magellan in a second effort to reach the east by going west. Thus all the world ocean was for the first time connected by sailing ships. The early age of sail was thus dominated by the Portuguese and Spanish, who succeeded in both cutting out a lot of middlemen in trade and bringing in the riches acquired in the New World. These riches from the New World also brought in the wealth that would lure in others to compete on the high seas and give the bullion and silver needed to pay for goods from the East. European goods were often not directly tradable in the East in similar amounts to what Europeans wanted to buy, so it was necessary to trade European goods elsewhere for what could be traded in the East. Often what was needed as a trade medium was either gold bullion or silver. This could either be acquired through trade as with Mali or conquest as in the Americas. Incidentally, as the Portuguese had circumvented the continental middlemen in trade by sailing around Africa, so too would other European powers sail the same route to cut out the Portuguese as middlemen. So each of the Atlantic kingdoms built their own ships to trade directly. And as the Spanish plundered the gold of America, so too did their treasure fleets fall prey to state-supported privateers. This was the era where the heavily armed and fast galleon became common in the naval arms race. A further development from the flood of precious metals from the Americas was that Mali became less important as a source of gold. So the route that started it all lost importance as the age of sail expanded. Another consequence of this was a large depreciation in the value of gold and silver as the markets were flooded with the American bounty, once again causing trade problems for the European kingdoms. It did not dampen the naval competition, however, as each kingdom now sought to be the next to find a better route to the east or a new bountiful continent. All of this led to significant exploration of the world ocean and the currents and wind patterns that govern it, all in an effort to arrive faster and more efficiently. Thus, exploration and the building of ships capable of exploring the Arctic came about in an effort both to find sources of fur trade and to find the northwest and northeast passage. Both were eventually found, but never became viable alternatives to the route around Africa. However much knowledge about the wind and currents around Africa was gathered, improving the speed of the trip. The Dutch, who became dominant at sea after the Spanish and Portuguese, developed the Brewer route, which made use of the Indian oceanic gyre to arrive faster in Indonesia. This, coupled with the significant improvement in shipbuilding, allowed for sailing ships to arrive ever faster and explore to the furthest corners of the world ocean. Even so, the greatest discoveries remained the Americas and the route around Africa, but the knowledge and sailing abilities continued to grow. And as Britain became the dominant naval power, it developed the clipper route as a fast way to Australia and New Zealand, making use of the strong winds of the circumantarctic current. At that time, the sail plans of the sailing ships had evolved and specialized dramatically, with brigantines and brigs doing much short-run cargo runs. Schooners were used in all sorts of types, from small two-masters going to the furthest corners of the ocean to massive multi-masters hauling base cargo at great distances. Barks were used as the workhorses of the sea to bring large volumes from continent to continent, and the fully rigged ships would fast-track the prized goods of the East back to the home markets. The fastest of these would be the clippers speeding across the waves. The age of sail did not meet its end because the development of cross-oceanic trade lessened, but because the age of steam started to replace the sails with steam engines. The huge windjammers of the late age of sail overlapped completely with the age of steam, competing efficiently with the steamships even after the Suez Canal had shortened the route of the steamships. In the end, many sailing ships still sailed into the modern era after diesel ships like Zealandia had been introduced.